Do you have any comments or thoughts?
I did not see any additions or corrections to the minutes, so I will make a motion that we approve those as submitted.
I would second. All in favor?
Aye.
Moving into new business. I think that's going to take a while for your presentation, so why don't we put you right on, if that's okay, Nina? And thank you for coming. We appreciate Strand allowing you to join us this evening.
Absolutely. I'm excited to be here. My name's Nina Dirk. I've been with Strand Associates for about 7 years now, working with the city of Circleville for many years. For the past couple of years, one of my main focuses has been the lead and copper rule through OEPA, through US EPA and then administered by OEPA. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about what that has meant for you all over the past couple of months and how I've been working with Jim and Brian to bring you all up to compliance, and then also kind of what those next steps are going to be looking like for you all. So today's agenda illustrates the status of the ongoing lead service line investigations for the city. So we're going to talk a little bit about the lead and copper rule history. This isn't a new thing. It's been around since the 80s, which you'll find out here soon. I'll kind of walk through the data that we reviewed to help get you all in compliance. The inventory spreadsheet itself, which was due just about a month ago on October 16th. The resident notification letters, which went out before the deadline of November 15th, and then what those next steps look like. All right, so our lead and copper rule history. So I'll do this pretty quick. Obviously, I'll skip a few steps in here since it has been, like I said, kind of coming to fruition since the 1980s. So it was formally adopted in 1991 by the EPA, and it was meant to further regulate lead and copper in drinking water. So as I mentioned, we kind of started to know that lead in drinking water may not be the most beneficial to human health in the late 1980s. And there have been various updates to those rules throughout the 2000s. I won't go into great detail about them all here, since there are so many. But really what we're going to be focusing on tonight is the lead and copper rule revisions, the LCRR, and the lead and copper rule improvements, the LCRI. Those are the two most recent updates that we've seen to the lead and copper rule. So really what these two lead and copper rule revisions and improvements did was they required the city of Circleville and every other city or public water system in the United States to categorize each and every one of their water service lines. So a water service line is basically the water main going from the water line in the street to your house. So it requires that each one of these be documented by the type, size, location, etc. It also required that notifications be sent to residents by that November 15th date that I mentioned, with a service line replacement plan then submitted, and all service lines replaced by starting in 2027 and going through 2037. And that would be any service line that is galvanized requiring replacement, lead, and then investigating any unknowns. And I'll talk more about what all that means here in a couple minutes. I don't expect you to be able to read the graphic on the screen. Basically, it's just outlining, it's from OEPA's website. It's outlining the differences from the lead and copper rule revisions through the lead and copper rule improvements. So we can all just kind of walk through what those changes have meant. So we did a thorough records review and investigation, which helped to lead to a comprehensive inventory for the city of Circleville. So you'll see a lot of different dates tossed around of when lead was actually banned in public water systems. The date that we'll be focusing on is September 12th, 1988. That is when Ohio adopted the lead ban in public water systems. It was adopted by the US EPA a couple years earlier. It just took each state a couple years or so to formally adopt the same rule. So this lead service line inventory provides a basis for for future investigation efforts. So I'll actually go back a slide and just kind of walk through what we did review for the city. So again, a little hard to read here, but the first question asks, was your city built after the lead and copper rule ban? We know that that's not accurate. So we then had to go down a step. When did lead service lines begin to be banned within the city? We didn't necessarily know that information, and so we went with that September 12th, 1988 date, which is when all lead was banned within Ohio in public water systems. Is there a record of when lead service lines were installed in the city or where they were installed? So luckily, the city has been categorizing and collecting a lot of data about the water system over the years. They recently did a water system replacement project where data was collected about the different water service materials that they encountered. And additionally, there's other records such as work orders, tap cards, things of that nature that we can review to understand where these lead service lines are. Additionally, we were able to collect auditor data, which helped us to understand when houses were built, to better understand whether or not they were built after that lead ban. If they were, it was safe to assume that there would not be a lead service line feeding their home. And then lastly, as we continue to gather more data, which the city is continuing to do as we work through this, we will continue to update that inventory and notify the public if a different record is found or a different piece of information to help build this puzzle. So back to the inventory. This is ultimately what we were filling out. Everything that you see up there in red is information that we had to fill out. It is a giant spreadsheet. Through that, we had to identify the address for each one of the customers that you all serve. We had to identify the latitude and longitude of those homes. We had to identify the service line material, how that service line material was determined, and other basic information for both the publicly owned side and the privately owned side of the service line. So like I mentioned before, this is basically a rule that came from US EPA, and now Ohio EPA is administering that rule as they see fit. So what is the system-owned and customer-owned portion that I'm talking about? This kind of helps to break it down. You have your house. Sometimes your meter might be in the house. Sometimes it might be outside of the house. But no matter where your water meter is, you have your water main. And from the water main to approximately the curb stop, which is typically around the property boundary, that is a system-owned portion of the water line. That is what the city is typically responsible for maintaining. And then on the other side of the property boundary, between the property boundary and the house, you have the customer-owned portion of the line. That's typically, if there were a break on that side of the line, that's typically what your customer would be responsible for maintaining. It's also typically what they put in themselves when the house was built. The city doesn't always have a hand in building that when the house itself is built. So from there, now that we understand the system-owned portion and the customer-owned portion of the service line, we had to fill in this material data for each side, for each home within the spreadsheet. So what does that mean? So we had to basically understand what each material within the system might look like. This is pretty easy to do at home, especially if your meter comes in your basement, or you can see the stick of pipe coming into your basement, which feeds the water throughout your home. You have your plastic pipe, copper pipe, which looks like a penny. You have your galvanized steel, which you would know because a magnet might stick to it. And then you have your lead. Lead is pretty soft. So if you were to take that same penny and scratch it, you would be able to tell it's lead because it would scratch. So that's basically what Jim and Brian and Josh Anderson, who's not here tonight, have all been helping with throughout the past couple years in gathering this data and continuing to move forward to continue to gather this data. They're looking at each water service on the customer side and the public side to understand where each of these materials are occurring, even if they're not lead, understanding where each of these materials are. So the lead service line inventory ultimately provided the basis for our future investigation efforts. As I mentioned, we went through work orders, we went through all of the data that was collected during the water meter changeout, we went through auditor data. There was a lot of aggregation going on of all this data to understand where there may be inconsistencies. And from there, we were able to understand that of the 6,195 water services that you all own and maintain, there are 10 lead service lines. There are 483 galvanized requiring replacement service lines and 1,668 service lines that are unknown. So our lead service lines might either be occurring on the public side or the privately owned side. Same with the unknowns and those galvanized requiring replacement. I will note that that unknown number means that those unknowns could be lead, meaning that those homes were built before 1988. So that's really what that means. Those unknowns that had homes built after 1988, they were not quantified in this number, as we can deduce that they would not have any lead in that part of the system. Galvanized requiring replacement basically means that your galvanized service line is upstream of a lead service line or an unknown service line, since we don't know whether or not it's lead or not. Galvanized lines are porous, and so they can absorb lead particles over time. And if that galvanized service line was disturbed at all, it could re-release those lead particles into the system, even if it's no longer connected to lead, basically. So again, we're just talking about that portion that's from the water main to the house. We're not talking about all the lines in the system. It's really a small portion of what makes up the water system. So of that, the city of Circleville sent 2,161 letters that were templates given from OEPA to basically let the public know if they had a lead galvanized requiring replacement or unknown service line. That's a lot of information. So, what does that mean for you all? You're probably going to be getting a lot of questions. You're all council members. You have people here that work in the city buildings, and they will have customers stopping by and asking questions and wanting to understand what each one of these letters means. And they might stop you in the grocery store and ask you, hey, I got this. What does it mean? So really, it's important to kind of, have me here, let you all know what it means, but also understand that it's coming from a place of fear sometimes, or not quite understanding where all this is coming from. Like I mentioned, we've known for a long time that lead isn't safe in the water system. The city's been doing a lot to gather all this data over time and get to where they are today, and continuing to, bring this number of unknowns down. But really having a cohesive message of what you're doing to continue to get ahead of this situation and answer questions, and have, your staff ready to have these discussions with the public is going to be the most beneficial thing to help quell any fears moving forward. So like I said, we're still working hard to continue to fill out this inventory. So we've gathered this data. Again, this is my graphic, which looks very small on that screen, but we've gathered this data. We've built this inventory. We know that there's still some missing information, so we're going to continue to investigate. We're going to continue to update it. We're going to continue to evaluate that information and figure out where there may be data gaps. And from there, have a complete inventory that the city can then create a service line replacement plan with through OEPA. And, these letters, they don't stop. If another lead service line was identified, or a galvanized requiring replacement line were identified, and a letter would go out to that resident to let them know. So, like I mentioned, by November 15th, 2024, those notification letters would be sent. You'll see I originally had a number of 3,000 in there. I will point out I apparently missed that as I was updating my slideshow. They've been able to identify, in the time of me making this presentation and coming to talk to you all, they've been able to identify about 1,200 additional records. So, like I mentioned, there's still a lot of work going into this, but they will be receiving each one of those letters that I previously mentioned. So what do these letters say?
Quick question.
Yes,
May I clarify? So the total number is actually the 3347?
the total number,
is the 2161.
it's the 2161.
Okay.
It was originally 3347, and through data gathering and additional records being found, we were able to bring that number down further.
Thank you.
Yep. So the lead service line and galvanized requiring replacement letters, these letters are super similar as they notify the customer of what their home or building is served by, whether it be lead or this galvanized requiring replacement. They detail the health effects of lead exposure. They list the steps to reduce the exposure, which is use cold water for cooking and drinking. You may have your water tested, things of that nature. If people are nervous about continuing to use water that may be served by a lead or galvanized line. It also outlines what the consumer can do about their lead or galvanized service line. They can go ahead and replace their privately owned service line, which then triggers the city, if it is lead or galvanized requiring replacement, to replace their side of the service line. So go ahead.
Another question. Why is cold water safer?
So that's a great question. Basically, if you were to use hot water and you had lead within your home, the lead could leach into the water through by using hot water. It basically increases the likelihood of it leaching into the water. If you use cold water, you don't have necessarily the same concerns, or less of a concern, but that would only be if the lead is in your faucet or in the actual pipe within your home. Since hot water doesn't come from the city, it's within your home. Go ahead.
Can I interrupt you just long enough to say that we test the heck out of our water?
Yes.
We have tested the water since I can remember. We have zero lead. We do testing within the home. There's zero lead. So therefore, thank you, US EPA, for creating my belief, a bureaucratic, unnecessary, overregulated fear. But that's just my opinion. Now, back to you.
Yes, I'll definitely get to the things that the city is doing to help lessen the concerns for lead in your all's drinking water.
Thank you.
So, the city is working, like I said, towards that 2027 deadline of a water service line replacement plan. And so, although these letters do not contain that plan at this time, as they continue to gather that information, they will continue to work towards having more answers for people on when their lead service line or galvanized requiring replacement line may be replaced. So there's also a lead status unknown letter that will be going out. That is the biggest number of letters going out and will probably have the most questions. In this letter, it basically says the material of your service line is unknown. It may be lead, it may be galvanized requiring replacement, or a non-lead material. We just don't know. It does also detail the same health effects of lead exposure. So I think this is where you're going to get a lot of questions. Obviously, the language in there is accurate, completely accurate, but it can also be really scary to read that and say, I don't know if I'm drinking lead or not. So it lists the same steps to reduce exposure to lead, and it outlines the same things that the consumer can do about their unknown service line. It also lets them know that they can verify their lead service line through some of those steps that I talked about earlier. And it also discusses that further investigation will be done to determine the material of their service line. So, like I mentioned many times, the city is still working diligently to understand each of these unknowns and understand what the service line material is. So, all notifications, regardless of the service line material, do include the health effects of lead. Like I mentioned, this language can be pretty strong and scary to read, and I think that's where you'll get the most of your questions just from reading the language. In children, this exposure in lead can lead to lower IQ, reduced attention span. It can lead to behavior and learning problems and slowed growth. In adults, this can lead to increased blood pressure, higher risk of heart disease, reproductive problems, and especially in pregnant women, they may also experience reduced fetus growth and or premature birth as a result of the lead exposure through drinking water. There have been a lot of studies. There's also other avenues to be exposed to lead, and I do want to take a moment to highlight that here. I'll discuss it in future slides too, but there are other ways in which people may be exposed to lead. So as I mentioned, the city staff is still working hard to limit the corrosion in water lines and plan projects to remove necessary service lines and validate all of the others. So there is a phosphate feed at the water treatment plant, which helps to reduce corrosion in the pipes. Basically, your service lines over time, they develop basically a film along the inside of the pipe. And if there were increased corrosion, that film would start to wear down, and that's where you may see lead in your service line. But through their phosphate feed, it helps to limit any potential corrosion in that service line. Additionally, we are doing an operation and needs review on the water treatment plant and reviewing alternatives for understanding, what may be in need of replacement at the water treatment plant. And through that, we will be doing an optimum corrosion control treatment study, which is currently underway. So that'll help us to understand that we're not increasing corrosion, which would increase any corrosion of that film within the service lines. Additionally, the city is currently pursuing multiple projects as part of their waterline capital improvement plan, which will help to verify some of these unknown service line materials and also help to replace any identified lead service lines. If lead service lines are encountered as part of those projects, they would replace them as they are encountered. So what are the next steps? Originally, we had discussed me being here a couple weeks earlier, but it didn't quite work out. So you've already actually done your notification to the public and reach out to them about verifying the customer side of the service line. That's where a majority of those unknowns are. So people that are worried about what their service line may be can likely go into their basement or their crawl space if they're able and do one of the tests that I talked about earlier. There's lots of resources on EPA's website on how to do tests on your system, and they're pretty easy to do. So customer verification will be a big piece of our next hurdle in understanding where lead service lines may be. We know a lot about the city-owned side. Additionally, annual inventory updates will be required every year, and by 2027, they will also include any connector materials, which is basically the small stretches of pipe between your water meter and connections into the home. So as we get closer to the 2027 deadline, there will be basically more information required. So the more ahead we can get on the unknowns, the more ahead you are in the whole process of getting your lead service line inventory completed. Additionally, the next steps will include validation. So as I mentioned, a lot of these service lines were identified through work orders and the water meter replacement program. So a 2-point visual inspection of a subset of the non-lead service lines will be completed in the coming years to basically verify that all the data that we compiled. And then lastly, service line replacements will start to occur. So the service line replacement plan will be underway starting in 2027. And within 10 years, all lead service lines, galvanized requiring replacement, and will be removed, and then all unknowns will be known at that point. On a 3-year rolling average, 10% of the service lines will be replaced every year. So the city getting ahead of this again on some of those capital improvement plan projects is really just setting you up for success in the long run, to start to tackle those other, 2,000 service lines, whether they be replacement or verifications. So that is what I have for you all today. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions because it's a lot of information to walk through.
I have a
Yes.
question. Will the lines that be replaced, will that just be the system-owned service line to basically the property line?
That is a great question. Ultimately, I can rely on you to answer some of that, but if federal funds are used to replace any portion of the service line, the entire service line from the water main to the home will need to be replaced. If the city chooses to use their own funds for the projects, then you could just replace a portion, the publicly owned portion of the service line, but it would not count towards that 10% rolling average if that happened. So you would basically not be meeting the EPA requirements at that point. But yeah, it's a little convoluted exactly how they will be enforcing that 10%, but they could enforce it. Go ahead.
So the EPA, so this is you should do this or you shall do this?
You shall do
Okay,
this.
so you shall do this. So kind of what Sherry just asked. So if we replace the main
Mhm.
and then we go to the meter, which could be at the curb or inside someone's home,
Mhm.
the property owner may say, I don't have the funds available. I can't afford it. I am not doing it. Talk me through that.
Yeah, and that's definitely one of the drawbacks of the rule is that you have no way to enforce the customer-owned side getting replaced.
Okay.
There may be certain ordinances and things that you can rely on or pass to help get ahead of this situation, but if you are using federal funds and are replacing the entire service line, I believe the thought is, who would give up the opportunity to have a free service line? If you are only replacing a portion of it, there's no requirement for the customer to replace their portion. Obviously, it may impact you all if they choose not to, but on the city's end, if you only replace the city-owned portion, you simply have to notify the customer that they have that you've replaced their side. You have to notify them of what their material is, and depending on that material, you may have to provide filters or testing or something of that nature.
So the funding component, we don't know yet.
So the funding component ultimately depends on how you all choose to fund these projects. A lot of the capital improvement plan projects that I've worked on are funded through OEPA water supply revolving loan account. And those do classify as federal funds and would require that full replacement. I don't know if you all want to add anything on how you may choose to fund these projects in the long run, but that's how I've seen it.
I'm sure that's another conversation for another day, but I'm trying to be realistic that, in some of these older portions of town where these lines are maybe residing,
Yes.
maybe the property owner just can't make it happen.
Right. And so in that instance, the city would be paying for that replacement. If the property owner, does not want the city to work on their property, I believe that there's steps to take. You have to make 3 good faith efforts to make communication,
Sure.
whether that be in person, a phone call, and a mailer, or, an email and, whatever other methods you may see fit. And then from there, I believe that you can work with your OEPA rep to potentially remove that customer-owned portion from a replaceable list. I totally understand you don't necessarily have jurisdiction on a customer's property. So how do you force them, or how do you, get them to allow you to step into their home? Because ultimately that is what will likely be necessary to complete that final connection to their home.
See, I see this as good news. In my 90-year-old home, they're not going to tear my yard up. They're going to stop at the curb stop.
Yeah.
And I think that's awesome.
But, so Brian, when we just did all those remote read meters and all those connections at the meter, is that when we were collecting the data? Like, what's the line? Okay. We shouldn't, I figured you probably should know that. Okay.
Just as a point of information, at our last meeting, we approved funding for you to apply for a loan for South Court Street, which was the beginning of this process, if I understand correctly. So we, the city of Circleville, speaking for you, has started.
Yes. And so right now there is not the same requirement to replace both sides, assuming that project is, funded and completing construction by 2027. There would not be the same requirement to replace the customer-owned side. And also verifications will be happening during the process of that construction to understand each one of those services, if any of them are unknown. And then from there, they would continue to approach new projects.
I have a little bit of information about lead because I live in a 150-year-old home. And when my children were small, it was definitely a concern.
Mhm.
There are many other sources, as you say, lead paint, those kinds of things that are bothersome for toddlers crawling around on the floor, getting into chips. And then also, if you do have lead, you can have lead pipes in your house. We're only talking about one section coming from the water main into the house at this point. So even if someone did test higher for lead, it could not necessarily be all this section, but also pipes. We had our pipes replaced in our home years ago. But if someone is concerned and would like to test their own water themselves, is that something we can give information out about how to get a test?
Absolutely. Did you include that?
We offered testing
Okay.
for the few that we had that we knew that we were identified as lead. So we offered that testing at our own facility for that. We didn't so much on the unknowns because we're not, at least in our belief, there aren't that many unknowns, that are lead. But in the ones that we identified, we did offer testing.
Understanding your presentation, understanding your background, so you understand this. If we have further questions that we really can't address, can we send those to you?
Absolutely.
I think you'll be able to better answer with confidence and trust, as far as that you would give them what the story is in more detail than we probably would be able to as a council member.
Yeah, and like I said, it's a lot of information to digest, and that's where I think the utilities department will be relied on heavily to, and they do understand this process. They've been going through it with me the past couple months, and so I think just continuing to educate staff and continuing to provide that input on here's our message. It's people with verified lead service lines can get free testing at the facilities, and here's how you can identify your service line, and just having that understanding across the board. So, Jim, Brian, and the other utility department staff can help to get customers to that place and that comfortability. Go ahead.
Yeah, so you touched a little bit on the actual exposure and lead base, or the lead exposure that we are trying to address, but if I understood, there's not really a lead exposure that we're aware of, or? Can you address that?
Yeah, absolutely. As of right now, there's no lead exposure that anybody is aware of within the city of Circleville. Obviously, there are outside communities that we've all heard about on the news. But in the city of Circleville, as of right now, there's no known lead exposure that's happening, especially on a widespread basis with, triggering all of this. It's coming down from US EPA to OEPA. Every public water system in the entire nation is working to meet these same deadlines and sending out very similar letters. They had prescribed language in them that were required. If anyone is nervous, I do encourage them to take advantage of the free testing. But again, as you mentioned, they may have lead lines within their home, which are leading to some of that exposure.
Thank you.
This is, I believe, at least accelerated by Flint. And Flint was a good example of keeping the water control not in control. And they went to the pH side and the acidic side, and therefore started dissolving pipes. We've just said that we're starting to put it in the water treatment plant that are anti-corrosion, if you will. So we're taking an additional step. Not only is our water lead-free, to the best of our knowledge, but we're trying to preserve it even so, furthermore. So I think Circleville can take a certain amount of assurance that we've got a competent staff, we've got your help, and we're going to follow the regulations.
Yep, absolutely. They're taking the steps that right now we know we can to help limit any potential lead exposure.
Thank you.
Great.
Any other questions? Thank you so much. I
Yes,
really appreciate
thank
you
you for
coming
having
down at 6 o'clock in the middle of the night to join
Feels
us.
like the middle of the night with how dark it is.
But thank you so much.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
That said, shall we move to new business? Melissa, would you read the new ordinance for us?
Yes, an ordinance authorizing the Director of Public Service to execute a permanent right-of-way easement to Cargill, Inc., granting it the right to install and maintain a modernizing unloading system across the lands owned by the city of Circleville, namely Canal Street, and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Jim.
Good evening. Just to add on to what Nina had up here is all projects we do moving forward, any of the capital improvement projects, we always try to get federal funding, even if it does add some things that we might have to do as far as replacing some lines going to the homes. Usually the benefit's much greater than the problems it might cause. So just to throw that out there. This ordinance is addressing Cargill's current loading system that they have at the Cargill plant next to the silos. It's a system that's been in there as long as I can remember. The siding or the rails currently exist on Canal Street. Therefore, anything that they use to load those rails or those cars is actually on the right of way, has been for 100 years. It's the way they've operated since that company has been in place. So this is just allowing them to construct a new system, a more efficient system, a better dust control system that is a benefit, we believe, to the public. It allows for, like I said, quicker loading, which should equate to less closure time on Main Street when the cars are stacked up for loading. Also, their intent is to build some additional stacking for cars so that they don't have to have them stacked across Main Street as much as they do now. So in conjunction with a quicker loading system, more stacking, it should reduce the number of closures on Main Street at the crossing significantly through the years coming. So that's what this ordinance allows them to go ahead and set up a new tower, place footers needed for that tower.
In a closed street already.
Right, correct. Canal Street has been closed to the public since 2018 or 2019.
So therefore utilization of the city of Circleville is not being affected.
The city has not maintained that street, as far as I know, in the past 30 or 40 years. There hasn't been any maintenance done on that. What's considered a street. Like I said, the siding actually uses that street. And when Norfolk Southern came through in 1864, basically the canal was done away with, and that's what Canal Street was for, was access to the canal. So it was no longer used.
Thank you. Any questions? Sole member of the committee? Barry.
The only comment I'll make, I know this just showed up, and I know this, the law director's office drafted this. Just make sure on the original Kendra initials it.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
I do have a question. I guess how much of Canal Street, or is this all the way from Main Street down?
It's the portions of canal that are currently closed. So it says contiguous with Cargill's property, which is basically where the rail line runs all the way down along their property down to near Houston Street.
I thought it was pretty long.
Yeah, so that would allow them to put additional siding all the way down to Houston Street as well.
I see.
Any questions?
Just that one.
Would you like to make a motion?
I will make a motion that we forward this to the next meeting, which is December 3rd, I believe,
Yep.
with a,
Looks right.
with a recommendation for passage.
Thank you. I'll second that. Could you take a roll?
Duval,
Yes?
Tice.
Yes.
Thank you.
Motion carried. Do we have any other additional business we should discuss this evening?
Not that I know of.
Therefore,
I will make a motion to adjourn.
I will second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. We have concluded our meeting at 6:43.